January 1st, 2020. The world celebrates the dawn of a new decade with the usual roar of fireworks and the clinking of glasses, blissfully unaware that the oxygen is about to leave the room. In the bustling wet markets of Wuhan, an invisible traveler has already begun its journey, a microscopic strand of RNA that will soon bring the global engine to a grinding, shuddering halt. Within weeks, the Roaring Twenties are replaced by the Great Silence. The bustling arteries of London, New York, and Tokyo turn into ghost towns, their neon lights reflecting off empty pavements. This is the year the impossible becomes the daily routine. We are about to witness the largest forced experiment in human history, a total shutdown of the physical world, and a desperate migration into the digital cloud. From the frantic, tear-filled corridors of Italian ICUs to the smoke-filled streets of Minneapolis, 2020 is the year the world's motherboard fried. It is the year we learned exactly how fragile our civilization truly is, when the machines stop humming and the air itself becomes a threat. The mask is on. The world is holding its breath. The world context of 2020 is defined by the Great Paralysis. By March, the global economy isn't just in recession, it is in a coma. The just-in-time world has run out of time. For the first time in human history, nearly 4 billion people, half the planet, are under some form of lockdown. The sky, usually crisscrossed by the white scars of jet engines, turns a deep, unnatural blue as global air travel collapses by 95%. This is the era of the interior, where the four walls of a home become the entire universe for the global population. Economically, the world enters a K-shaped abyss. While the service industry, travel, and retail are decimated, the digital giants, Amazon, Zoom, and Netflix, become the new landlords of our reality. We are witnessing the Great Acceleration, where 5 years of digital transformation are compressed into 5 months. The office is dead. The Zoom room is born. We are hyperconnected via fiber optic cables, yet physically isolated, experiencing a collective trauma that bridges every border. Culturally, the mood is a cocktail of Tiger King escapism and existential dread. We are obsessed with flattening the curve, a phrase that becomes the new global mantra. But beneath the surface, the context is one of deep, simmering inequality. The essential worker, the delivery driver, the nurse, the grocery clerk, becomes the sacrificial lamb of the modern economy, while the laptop class watches the world burn from the safety of their screens. The context of 2020 is a planet stripped of its distractions, forced to look into the mirror and confront the systemic rot that has been festering for decades. It is a world of sourdough starters and refrigerated morgue trucks, a world that has been shocked into a state of permanent hypervigilance. The spark that fundamentally changed the trajectory of the 21st century occurred in late January, but the world didn't truly feel the snap until March 11th, 2020. That was the day the World Health Organization officially declared COVID-19 a pandemic. It was the inciting event because it triggered the Great Closing. Within 48 hours, the NBA suspended its season, Tom Hanks announced he was infected, and the borders of Europe began to slam shut. The illusion that we could manage our way out of this with traditional tools vanished. This wasn't just a health crisis, it was a total systemic reset. The inciting event forced the immediate suspension of the free market. Governments that had spent decades preaching fiscal restraint suddenly began printing trillions of dollars in stimulus to prevent a total social collapse. It was the moment the individual was replaced by the collective, where your choice to wear a mask or stay home became a matter of life and death for your neighbor. The viral lockdown changed the lens of 2020. Every subsequent event, from the stock market's Black Monday to the cancellation of the Tokyo Olympics, was a ripple effect of this one, massive stone thrown into the pond of history. It triggered a global migration to the cloud, transforming the internet from a luxury into a utility as vital as water or electricity. This event ensured that 2020 would be remembered as year zero for the post-globalization era. It was the moment we realized that a virus in a distant province could bankrupt a restaurant in a small town halfway across the globe. The inciting incident proved that our connectedness was our greatest weakness. Politics in 2020 was played out in the shadow of a mounting body count. The defining political event was the 2020 U.S. presidential election, a contest that pushed the world's most powerful democracy to the edge of a nervous breakdown. It wasn't just a race between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. It was a referendum on reality. Conducted in the heat of a pandemic, it saw the largest expansion of mail-in voting in history, a logistical feat that would later be weaponized into the big lie. The political map was a battlefield of masks versus liberty. While the US was gripped by partisan paralysis, other parts of the world saw a power grab. From Hungary to the Philippines, leaders used emergency powers to crack down on dissent, turning the pandemic into a tool for autocracy. In the East, the national security law in Hong Kong effectively ended the one country, two systems era, as Beijing moved to silence the city's pro-democracy movement while the world was distracted by the virus. The US election culminated in a political heart attack. The days of counting, the blue shift, and the subsequent refusal of the incumbent to concede created a vacuum of power that led directly to the chaos of early 2021. It was a political event that exposed the deep structural fractures in the American experiment. 2020 was the year that truth became a partisan choice, and the very act of counting a vote became a radical political statement. It was a year where the state proved it could be both omnipotent, sending checks to millions, and completely incompetent, failing to provide the basic PPE needed to protect its frontline heroes. Socially, 2020 was the year the pressure cooker exploded. On May 25th, the death of George Floyd under the knee of a Minneapolis police officer triggered a global reckoning that had been building for 400 years. The video, shared millions of times on social media, acted as a moral lightning bolt. Despite the lockdowns, tens of millions of people took to the streets in the largest protest movement in human history. This was the summer of reckoning, where the pandemic's isolation met the raw fury of systemic injustice. From London to Sydney, statues of colonial figures were toppled, and the phrase "Black Lives Matter" was painted in giant yellow letters on the streets leading to the White House. This was a social realignment. It forced a global conversation about race, policing, and the hidden history of the West. At the same time, the social fabric was tearing in other directions. The anti-mask and anti-lockdown movements began to merge with QAnon conspiracies, creating a shadow reality that spread through Facebook groups like a secondary virus. The social landscape was also defined by the year of the essential. We saw a strange duality: the nightly clap for carers in the UK and the banging of pots in New York, contrasted with the reality of low-wage workers being forced into dangerous conditions for minimum pay. 2020 was the year of social distancing, but it was also the year of social proximity, where we were forced to confront the lives of people we usually ignored. It was a year where the town square was both a literal battlefield of tear gas and a digital arena of cancel culture. By the end of the summer, the world felt like it had been rewired. The social contract was no longer a given. It was something that had to be fought for in the streets. As 2020 entered its final months, the double threat of the pandemic and the climate began to escalate into a compounding catastrophe. The second wave of COVID-19 hit Europe and North America with a ferocity that made the spring look like a rehearsal. Hospitals that had barely recovered were once again overwhelmed, and the lockdown fatigue turned into lockdown fury. The escalation was the realization that there was no quick fix. Simultaneously, the natural world escalated its own offensive. The 2020 Western United States wildfire season was the most intense on record, with gigafires turning the sky over San Francisco a terrifying Martian red. In the Atlantic, the hurricane season was so active that meteorologists ran out of names and had to move to the Greek alphabet. The escalation was the unmasking of the future, a world where the pandemic was just one of many force multipliers for disaster. The stakes were raised further by the information escalation. As the US election approached, the surge of disinformation reached a saturation point. Every news story was contested, and the echo chambers became bunkers. The momentum was toward a total fracturing of reality. By December, as the first cold storage trucks began moving the first doses of the vaccine, the world was at its lowest ebb. The escalation wasn't just about the virus or the fires, it was about the collapse of the collective will. The "we're all in this together" spirit of March had evaporated, replaced by a survival of the fittest mentality that threatened to tear the social fabric apart just as the solution was finally in sight. Despite the pervasive darkness, 2020 delivered a scientific supernova that took society forward by decades in a single year. The greatest high was the mRNA miracle. In less than 10 months, scientists designed, tested, and began distributing vaccines for a completely new virus, a process that usually takes 10 years. The high of November 9th, when Pfizer announced a 90% efficacy rate, was a civilizational win. It proved that when the planet's collective brainpower and resources are focused on a single enemy, we are capable of the impossible. In the world of technology, 2020 saw the high of the commercial space age. SpaceX's Crew Dragon successfully carried NASA astronauts to the International Space Station, marking the first time a private company had launched humans into orbit. It was a high that signaled the end of the government monopoly on the stars and the beginning of a new era of exploration. Even in the chaos, there were wins created by chaos. Global carbon emissions saw their largest ever annual drop, providing a natural high that showed the world what a green recovery could actually look like. Cultural highs were found in the global digital concerts and the rise of TikTok creativity, where a new generation found a voice in the vacuum. These highs took society forward because they were triumphs of logic over chaos. People believed that if we could rewrite our genetic code to fight a plague and land rockets on the moon during a shutdown, then maybe, just maybe, we could solve the bigger problems of the 21st century. The lows of 2020 were defined by unnecessary loss and systemic cruelty. The low point was the individual tragedy multiplied by 1.8 million, the number of lives lost to the virus by the end of the year. This was a low of the soul, the millions of people who died alone in sterile rooms, denied a hand to hold or a final goodbye. This was the year of the digital funeral, a low that moved society toward a profound collective grief that we still haven't fully processed. The lows were also found in the economic guillotine. Over 100 million people were pushed back into extreme poverty, reversing 2 decades of progress in a single year. In the US, the sight of miles-long food bank lines in the world's wealthiest nation was a low of credibility for the capitalist dream. The failures were not just biological, they were moral. The vaccine nationalism that began to emerge in late 2020 was a low of solidarity, a signal that the global village was every man for himself. In the streets of Beirut, the August port explosion was a low of governance, a literal and metaphorical blast that destroyed a city already on its knees. These lows moved society in the wrong direction by entrenching fear and distrust. They were the human cost of a world that had prioritized efficiency over resilience. 2020 ended with a world that was physically scarred, economically broken, and psychologically haunted. "2020 will be remembered as the year the 20th century finally ended. It was the historical turning point where the digital world became the primary world. It mattered because it was a global stress test that exposed every crack in our civilization. We learned that normal was the problem. This was the year that state power returned in a way not seen since World War II, where a government could tell you to stay in your house and you would listen. Why was it a turning point? Because it marked the end of the illusion of control. It reshaped history by forcing a great reset of our priorities. What ended was the age of carefree connectivity. What began was the age of fragility, where every supply chain, every job, and every breath was now seen as a potential risk. 2020 reshaped history by proving that we are a single, interconnected organism, and that the health of the individual is the only true measure of the health of the species. The impact of 2020 is the very foundation of our 2026 lives. The hybrid world we inhabit, where the office is a choice and the digital nomad is the norm, was born in the lockdowns of that year. The sovereign supply chains and the onshoring of medicine we now see were direct responses to the Great Paralysis. We live in a world of permanent surveillance, a trade-off we made for public health in 2020. The mRNA platforms that now provide us with cancer treatments were perfected during the miracle of 2020. However, the crisis of truth and the deep polarization that started in the mask wars of that year are now the permanent features of our political landscape. We live in a world that is more efficient, more digital, but also more anxious. 2020 taught us that the world can stop on a dime. We are the survivors of that stop, navigating a reality where the only normal is the unpredictable. 2020 was the year the world went quiet, only to find its own pulse again. It was a year of mRNA miracles and ventilator nightmares, a year that exposed the rot, but also the resilience. We entered it thinking we were masters of the universe, and we left it realizing we were just passengers on a very fragile ship. The exposure of 2020 is complete, but the story of the decade continues in 2021. If this year surprised you, challenged what you thought you knew, or reminded you of something you lived through, leave a comment with what it meant to you. If this series helps you understand the present through the past, consider liking the video. And if you want every year exposed, subscribe to the channel. History isn't just something we watch, it's something we interpret, and something many of us lived through. Another year exposed is coming soon. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter.